rancher in southern Arizona built a wall out of loose stone. It was not tall enough to lean on. A child could step over it. His neighbors accused him of stealing water that had been sitting underground since before the pyramids were built. The state sent scientists to check. What they found was stranger than the accusation. The stones were not touching that ancient water at all. They could not physically reach it. And yet wells that had been dry for decades started rising anyway. Hold on to that question. Because to explain it, we have to go back to a man, a shovel, and a road that would not stop falling apart.
Copy that.
This is Titan Build. In 1981, in the mountains of southeastern Arizona, a rancher named Josiah Austin had a problem with a road. A gully was eating it, one monsoon at a time. He rolled 4 rocks into the gully. Nothing scientific, just enough weight to slow the water down. The road held. Then August arrived. 105 degrees. Every plant on that hillside had gone brown and brittle. Not sweater weather. Except one patch, sitting directly behind those 4 rocks. Green, his wife, Valor Austin, noticed it with him. Neither of them had a single day of formal training in hydrology.
Flow rate suggests cavitation.
4 rocks and a stubborn houseplant of a desert shrub. That was the entire research budget. By their own account. That patch of green is where all of this started. If 4 rocks could keep one plant alive through 105 degrees, what could thousands of rocks do to an entire dying valley? The valley they picked to test that question was called Cienega Ranch. 33,000 acres, outside a town called Willcox. Cienega is the Spanish word for a desert marsh. This particular one had been dry for over 100 years. To understand why the Austins thought a pile of rocks could fix that, you first have to understand what a cienega actually is, and what killed it. A healthy cienega has no channel at all. Water does not run through it in a line. It spreads sideways across a wide flat surface, held there by a thick mat of roots, black and spongy underfoot. Pull that root mat away, even once, and the water stops spreading. It starts cutting downward instead. In the 1880s, cattle arrived in these valleys by the hundreds of thousands. Old accounts describe grass tall enough to brush a rider's boot in the saddle. Within a decade, it was gone. Then the weather turned violent. Years of hard, sudden rain, followed immediately by drought. With nothing left to hold the ground, the water did what water always does when it is handed a straight, bare path. It cut. Geologists call it arroyo cutting. A wide, wet meadow becomes a narrow trench, sometimes 20 feet deep. About the height of a 2-story house, sunk straight into the valley floor. Every trench works like a drain. It pulls the local water table down to the bottom of itself. The cienegas sitting above those trenches did not slowly fade. In geological terms, they died standing up, almost overnight. That was collapse number 1. A century later, the same valley started emptying out again, for a completely different reason. Pistachio orchards, pecan groves, industrial dairies. Arizona, for decades, barely regulated groundwater outside its cities, so the pumps ran continuously, faster than the mountains could ever refill the basin underneath. One hydrogeologist who studied the region later summed up those decades in 5 words: no rules, free water. Groundwater levels in the Willcox Basin have dropped more than 400 feet in some areas. That is roughly the height of a 40-story building. Except it happened underground, where nobody was watching. The ground itself has responded the only way desert clay can respond to that much water loss. It has sunk, and it has cracked. Almost 50 miles of open fissures now run across this valley. Fractures wide enough, in places, to swallow a person whole. Nobody wants to find one at night. This is the ground Josiah and Valor Austin decided to fix. With rocks. Their early attempts used the standard tool of the era. Wire baskets packed with stone, called gabions. Gabions have a well-known failure mode. The wire corrodes. Floodwater digs underneath the base. The whole structure rolls over. At that point, a gabion stops being a dam. It becomes debris, moving downstream at speed, doing more damage than the flood alone ever would have. An expensive way to build a landslide. So the Austins needed something with a very specific, very stubborn set of properties. It had to leak, like a gabion. It had to survive, like a real dam. And under Arizona water law, it was legally required to let water keep moving downstream, because those flows already belonged to someone else, further down the valley. On paper, that last rule should have doomed the entire idea. A structure legally forbidden from actually stopping water. It turned out to be the design's single greatest strength. None of this technique was invented from scratch on this ranch. In the 1970s, an Australian farmer named Peter Andrews began laying loose rock and timber across creeks on his own land, built with gaps on purpose, designed to slow water rather than block it. In the American Southwest, a retired Forest Service biologist named Bill Zedek refined the same idea into a whole family of small structures. The Trinchera, the One Rock Dam, the Zuni Bowl, the Media Luna. Archaeologists have since mapped Trincheras, low rock walls across small drainages, built by people in this same region roughly between 800 and 1200 years ago. Which raises an uncomfortable point. The most advanced water technology in this valley may also be the oldest one. The structure the Austins eventually settled on is properly called a leaky weir. Rock, set directly into exposed bedrock at the bottom of the channel, cemented loosely enough to let water pass through slowly, on its own schedule. The largest one on the ranch stands about 7 feet tall and stretches 260 feet across the valley floor. Most of the length of a football field, built entirely from stacked stone, built by people with strong opinions about landscaping. A flood cannot dig underneath it, because there is nothing to dig into. It is locked straight onto bedrock. Here is the part that took the better part of 2 decades to fully understand. The weir was never really built to hold back water. It was built to hold back sand. A desert flood is not clean water rushing downhill. It is closer to wet concrete. Sand, gravel, torn vegetation, all moving together at speed. Cut that speed in half and the flood can no longer carry its heaviest cargo. The sand drops, and it stays. Sand sitting on bedrock behaves like a small, private reservoir. Every flood after that thickens it a little more. One of the 2 structures the government later studied filled completely with sediment within 2 years. That is not a failure. That is the design finishing its job on schedule. You simply build the next layer on top, and let the next flood keep filling. By 2024, 15 of these weirs had gone into the ranch, since serious work began in 2014. Not everyone downstream was convinced. Some ranchers accused the Austins of hoarding water that belonged to the whole valley, not one property. Even respected voices in the restoration world were openly skeptical. Bill Zedek himself warned publicly that structures like this eventually fail, the same slow way gabions do. So the United States Geological Survey came out to actually measure it. Researchers set up 3 neighboring stretches of the ranch, 2 fitted with leaky weirs, 1 left completely untouched as a control. Okay. Sensors went into wells to track the water table hour by hour. Gauges went into the channel to record the exact height of every flood that came through. According to the resulting study, published through the journal Applied Water Science in 2025, 1 major flood hit the weirs at roughly 450 cubic feet per second and left the structure at closer to 140. The weir had taken something like 70% off the top of that flood on its own. With no moving parts, no pump, no electricity. The maintenance budget is 0. Try beating that with concrete behind it. Researchers credited the 2 studied structures with trapping somewhere around 2,700 tons of soil that would otherwise have simply washed away downstream. Roughly the weight of a loaded cargo ship's worth of desert, staying exactly where it fell. Above the weirs, water sat in the ground for the large majority of the year.
The water level down there.
Below them, in the untreated control stretch, the water was gone almost as fast as it had arrived. Then came the detail that actually settled the argument with the neighbors. The research team sampled water from 10 wells and a spring, and dated it using tritium and carbon-14, the same isotope methods used to age fossils. The shallow water, sitting just beneath the weirs, dated to roughly 235 years old. The deep water, pulled from wells drilled much further down, dated to somewhere between 4,300 and 9,000 years old, with no trace of anything modern in it at all. 9,000 years old is older than the pyramids, older than written language, older than agriculture in most of the world. That deep water arrives through solid rock, seeping down from the mountains themselves over thousands of years. Nothing built inside a streambed can touch it. Empty at once, and nobody alive today will ever see it refill. The rocks were never stealing the ancient reservoir. They were building an entirely new one. Shallow, young, sitting directly above the old one. Like a second floor added onto a house, nobody thought could take the weight. A private aquifer, made of sand and stone, that simply did not exist 15 years ago. The valley responded almost immediately once the water started staying. Native grasses returned within a season or two in some stretches. Big saccaton, a bunch grass tall enough to close over a standing adult, came back into the drainages and started holding the banks together on its own. No maintenance crew required. Chiricahua leopard frogs, a species under federal protection, began laying eggs in standing water on the property again. In 2016, a jaguar was caught on a trail camera crossing the ranch. Only the seventh individual documented north of the Mexican border in 3 decades. Nobody photographs a jaguar in southern Arizona twice. Black-tailed prairie dogs were reintroduced in 2021, the first release of that species anywhere in the county. Burrowing owls followed 2 years later, which was not a coincidence. They nest almost exclusively inside abandoned prairie dog burrows and refuse to dig their own. Free real estate, zero rent. None of this makes the story a clean, uncomplicated victory. It would be dishonest to leave it there. The researchers themselves are careful about what they can and cannot claim. They cannot fully separate how much of the rising water table comes from the weirs versus how much simply comes from thirstier new plants, pulling less water out of the ground each summer. Answering that cleanly would take a dedicated tracing study nobody has funded yet. Their control site was imperfect, and a great deal of the strongest flood data rests on a small number of storm events, because in a desert, you only get to measure the storms the sky actually decides to send you. Not far from Cienega Ranch, the Austin's own foundation applied the same philosophy at a much larger scale across ranches straddling the Mexican border. Over roughly 30 years, that effort has protected more than 130,000 acres and built over 50 large gabions, close to 40,000 small one-rock dams, and more than 1,000 berms by hand. Hugh's deer and Gould's wild turkey, both locally scarce for decades, have returned to parts of the Chiricahua Mountains as a direct result. 40,000 small rock dams is not a hobby. It is closer to a second full-time career, built one wheelbarrow at a time. The bigger fight, though, was never really about the science. It was about who gets to use the water sitting underneath everyone's feet. In November of 2024, close to 350 residents packed a community center in Willcox. The state was proposing to formally regulate the basin, measuring wells, freezing new farmland at its current footprint. Vineyard and orchard owners argued the restriction could gut a regional agricultural economy the state itself had allowed to grow here for decades, with almost no rules attached. Their argument was not unreasonable. Nobody in that room had broken a single law getting here. Then a resident stood up and described her own home, split down the middle by ground subsidence, no longer safe to sell and barely safe to live in.
Look steady.
This ground does not do second chances. A few weeks later, Arizona's water director designated the Willcox Basin as the state's 7th active management area anyway. It was the first time in Arizona history that kind of designation had been made directly by a single official, rather than decided at the ballot box by local voters. Existing wells could keep pumping. New irrigated farmland could not be added. The stated goal is to cut the region's water deficit roughly in half by 2075. Whether that target is even achievable is still an open argument. In that same community center, and the rocks themselves remain vulnerable to something no amount of stone can stop. A single wildfire on the slopes above the ranch could strip away a decade of vegetation and bury the weirs in ash and debris in one storm. One bad summer undoes 40 years of patience. A conservation easement protects the land these structures sit on. It does not, and cannot, protect the water flowing invisibly underneath it. Someone once asked Josiah Austin how he actually knew any of this was working underneath all the sensors and the isotope charts. His answer had nothing to do with government studies. He said he looks out from his porch now, and instead of dust, he sees a sea of grass. 15 piles of loosely stacked rock will never refill an entire desert basin on their own. Nobody involved claims that they will. What they proved instead is smaller, and in its own way, more useful than a single miracle fix. This particular stretch of dead ground had not actually forgotten how to hold water. It was simply waiting for someone stubborn enough to give it a reason to try again. Which of these numbers is the hardest one to believe? The 70% flood cut, the 9,000-year-old water, or the jaguar? Put it in the comments. More stories like this one: animal engineers, human engineers, rock, concrete, and everything stranger. Every week on Titan Build. Subscribe if that is your thing. Here is the question worth sitting with before you go. If a handful of loose stones can rebuild an aquifer that took the desert thousands of years to lose, how much of the land we have already written off as dead is only waiting for someone to test it?